The first universal state-sponsored pension plan appears in Germany in 1889 in response to the massive wave of emigration that Germany was experiencing, as contemporary America was offering free land in the Midwest to anyone who would move from Europe to simply come and work it. So in order to retain its population, which was ultimately the foundation of the imperial military, Germany decided to take the approach of competing with America to offer superior benefits to its citizens. Now, this type of approach was not entirely new. Chinese Chancellor Wang Anshi began to introduce similar kinds of provisions during his tenureship as chancellor from 1069 through 1075. During this time, he introduced the kinds of social programs that we would recognize in the 20th century, like state-sponsored loans to farmers or state-backed orphanages. But importantly, he also introduced a state-backed pension for the elderly. Now, unfortunately for China, none of these reforms outlasted Wang's period in power, and by 1080, all of his reforms have been reversed by those people who opposed him in the Chinese imperial court. But strictly speaking, turning back to the case of Germany, one of the things we see with state sponsorship is that they are much more efficient than any of the privately sponsored pension plans that we saw emerging from insurance companies or from employers. And this is because states are able to mandate contributions from all workers. They can adjust benefits as they need to. And of course, they have the benefits of massive diversification with sometimes millions of contributors to these pension plans rather than thousands. An important feature of Bismarck's early pension was that in order to draw on it, you had to be at least 70 years old. And this at a time when life expectancy for German men was approximately 38 and German women was approximately 42. With only 3% of people actually living long enough to collect on this sort of pension, funding it on a purely pay-as-you-go basis imposed a relatively small burden on workers. And it wasn't actually until 1916 that the pensionable age was reduced to 65 that we so commonly associate with retirement today. Now, while state-sponsored pension plans do offer significant economic advantages, largely due to their scale and their ability to adjust both contributions and payouts, one of the problems we find with them is that politicians are often inclined to make rather generous promises to beneficiaries that are expected to be financed by future contributions of workers. Now, this is all well and good while you have a large number of workers relative to a small number of pensioners. But unfortunately, what we find is that many politicians, particularly in Western democracies, were unconcerned about meeting the funding obligations that would be necessary to support the kinds of benefits that were being offered. Now, again, this is not much of a problem in a young country where you've got a relatively large number of workers compared to a relatively small number of retirees. But as we start moving through the 20th and 21st century, what we began to experience was called demographic inversion, where there were fewer and fewer children being born. And instead of having a population pyramid with a wide base, we began to transform more into a bubbled tube shape, where we have an unusually large number of elders by historical standards, and not necessarily enough young workers to continue supporting them in the way that was originally envisaged at the end of the 19th century. Now, one of the big problems that is compounded here is the nature of state-sponsored pensions and inflation. As states in the 20th century began to compete to offer more and more generous welfare benefits to their citizens, they actually began to set off significant amounts of inflation. States were not always producing enough additional value to pay for these benefits. And that meant, of course, that they would pay for these benefits by simply running the printing press and devaluing currency, effectively transferring wealth from the wealthier members of society to the government, who would then redistribute it in the form of a pension plan. To understand the extent of inflation here, between 1960 and 1971, the United Kingdom experienced a change in inflation from 1% to 9%. Now, mathematically, it's important to understand what this means for a pension that pays out a fixed amount of cash. Inflation of just 3% a year cuts the purchasing power of fixed payments in half in the span of 24 years. So people who retire at age 65 and experience 3% inflation find that the real purchasing power of their fixed pension has actually been cut in half by the time they reach 90 years of age. And this means even though people might imagine that they are going to collect a fixed benefit throughout their retirement, What in fact they experience is a declining purchasing power throughout their retirement, which has contributed to significant problems among elder poverty throughout Canada and a number of other Western nations. Now, one of the solutions to this problem has been to index pension benefits to inflation, either fully or partially. But of course, we have to recognize that indexation involves holding back some benefit each year so that we can reinvest that sum, ensuring a larger payout comes each year at a rate that compensates people for the declining value of currency. It's been estimated that full indexation to inflation would reduce the average pension payout by as much as 25%. Nonetheless, this has become an important feature of many pensions today, as we recognize that people who have particularly extended lifespans are very vulnerable to inflationary risks.